and welcome to the Piping Pastor Theology Talks. I thought that dividing the channel into a couple of different categories of videos might be helpful to some of you who may have an interest in theology, but not necessarily some of the other topics. Since that's one of the main thrusts of the channel, of course, is the poetry and the Bible, that many of you are interested in theology. So I thought maybe a separate series of videos. And then, of course, going forward, if a great deal many of you have an interest just in pipe smoking or men's fashions, then maybe a separate series of videos for that as well. But as for now, I thought maybe dividing into two categories. And as this is the introductory video for the theology videos, I thought it would be helpful to discuss some categories and definitions. Because we have a tendency sometimes to use academic jargon, and when I say we, I mean both pastors and academics, to use academic jargon without really giving any thought to it because we spend so much time using it. And most people are just not conversant in those terms, and it kind of leaves you wandering around in the woods. So, to begin with, in the study of theology and the Bible and so forth, you have two major categories. It's biblical studies and theology. Now, church history is also in there. I shouldn't leave church history out. Church history is kind of its own thing. And in all honesty, I have several friends who are historians in that vein. And they're kind of in an opposition themselves because they're halfway between the School of Humanities in the History Department and the School of Divinity. Because they're studying history and historiography the same way historians of other interests do, but because theirs crosses over so much with sacred issues, they find themselves normally right in the School of Divinity. And honestly, because those of us who study theology and biblical studies usually try to find them out to ask them questions anyway, so probably a good idea that they're there. At the end of my bowl here, my three nuns. Now, the two categories that I mentioned, biblical studies and theology. Biblical studies is the study of languages, so classical Hebrew, Koine Greek, Aramaic, the original languages, not the translated languages like Latin and so forth, although many of them read, write, and speak Latin as well. And they also engage in contextual criticism, historical criticism, literary criticism, all the schools of criticism that come out of German school of interpreting the text. And they spend their time delving into the text and exegeting Scripture, shedding light on Scripture, reading and poring over and figuring out, okay, when this was written, they meant it this way, in this language, and this verb twins, and so on and so forth. It really digs into the minutiae of the text. And then out of that study comes various different subsets, from Old Testament studies, New Testament studies. Biblical theology is really closely related to biblical studies, although it's on the theology side. And in truth, those of us on the theology side of the fence who deal with those things rely on our partners in biblical studies to make sure we've got things right when we're trying to come up with theological ideas or sort out theological conundrums. It's far better to get an expert in biblical studies and say, hey, I've translated this text this way. Are you seeing the same thing? It's kind of like getting your math checked by another professor. So they're very closely related, biblical studies and theology. But theology is what we're going to be talking about because that's the side of the fence that I follow. In particular, my area of research is science and religion, which might be a third series of videos if we need to separate it that far out. Probably not. But within theology, you have, again, several subcategories. You have systematic theology, You have biblical theology, which I mentioned. You have practical theology. Practical theology is essentially what pastors and ministers, like myself, use often. It is, quite frankly put, the practical application of theology. It's the theology we use in counseling. It's the theology we use oftentimes forming messages if we're doing topical sermons. Expository preaching is usually more biblical studies related, but it's basically the day-to-day operation of our faith, is practical theology. Biblical theology is, again, really closely linked to biblical studies. It's the exegesis of Scripture in a theological manner. So pouring out the ideas of theology based on scriptural text, and it's again really closely related to exegesis, shining light on the Scripture. Systematic theology is also called dogmatic theology, and that's where we get all the various different theological subcategories that people do PhDs in. So, theological anthropology, soteriology. Theological anthropology is essentially, if you think like creation theology, like where humans came from, the progress of humans throughout history from a theological perspective. And then soteriology is the study of salvation, the idea that the salvific experience and what that means, and so forth. You have theodicy, which is dealing with the problem of evil. These are all subcategories of systematic or dogmatic theology. And most all theologians who spend their time studying and writing and being published and teaching eventually write their own systematic theology. So they go through each one of these categories and write their own view of what theodicy is, their own view of what salvation is, their own view of theological anthropology, so on and so forth, usually in large volumes of books. That's mainly what we're going to be getting into in these videos. So we are going to start in our next video, in theological video number 2, on creation theology. I thought, why not just jump in with both feet to probably one of the more controversial discussion topics in Christian theology, certainly in evangelical circles. And we'll be discussing creation theology, young earth creation theology, and perhaps a bit of theological anthropology. I don't know if we'll get that far into it. I'm trying to keep these videos around 10-12 minutes tops. So we may just be discussing deep time and the beginning of the universe at t = 0, or everything started 9,000 years ago and humans and dinosaurs walked around together. What that looks like, how we interpret that, and what Genesis 1 and 2 really has to say. So that will be in our next video, and I hope you enjoy it. And if so, by all means, comment, and let's keep the discussion going, because none of us is as smart as all of us. So until that time, I hope you enjoy these new set of videos, and I look forward to sharing with you. Happy reading.